Today I'm going to be talking about some fairly interesting predictors of event success. At least I find them interesting. Hopefully you will too. Quick disclaimer, for these purposes, success is defined as dollars. And in our world, dollars equals wetlands, and dollars is also a good barometer of how many people were at your event and how much fun they had. So it's useful knowing full well that success goes beyond dollars a lot of times. But for apples and apples, a nice objective way to compare events year over year, dollars is the way to do it, and that's what we'll be talking about here. So with that, let's look at the dollars. Here's a bunch of events, year-over-year performance, stacked next to each other. And you don't need to see it in detail, but you're going to see the patterns. And what you're going to see is a lot of consistency. Events are up or down, 5 or 10% year-over-year. But every now and then, you have outliers. And in this particular year, we had some significant outliers. A couple of events that really turned it on, and a couple of events that really went soft. And so anytime you have the situation with a nice consistent baseline and a couple outliers, you have a learning opportunity to study these outliers and see what made them different. So that's what I did. The green events are the ones that were up significantly. Red events are ones that were down significantly. No big surprise here. Ticket sales drives everything. We always say fill the hall. No big surprise there. More bodies in the door equals more money in the door. And of course, more buying power or more buying pressure on the items at your event. That's why we always say fill the hall. The problem is you have to look behind it. It's one thing to say it, but you got to figure out how to do it. And so that's what the rest of this is about, is how are these guys filling the hall or failing to. So you look at it a little bit deeper. One of the things that bubble out in terms of a pattern is you see a clear organizational improvement on the green events. And I'm defining organization as recruiting and delegating. You really can't have one without the other. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to recruit people and not put them to work, and you can't really delegate if you don't have people. So you saw across the board, the guys that were really good at building a team and empowering a team were consistently the green, not so much in the red case. Another thing that bubbled out of here was a date change. And I'm talking about a radical date change here. You saw an awful lot of that winding up in these red events, and I'll explore that a little bit more in the next slide. Change of leadership also had a bit of a correlation that was interesting. We had some green events do just fine with the change of leadership, but by and large, change of leadership was showing up a preponderance of the time on these red events. By the way, for nomenclature here, a 0.5 means it wasn't quite a radical change, but an X means that was pretty significant blip on the radar there. So, digging in a little bit more, let's look at the fundamentals behind an event. Fundamentals to me are planning, organizing, selling, and building a quality product that people want to come out for. And when you kind of slice and dice these on that versus some of the flavor of the day stuff you might do, you see some more patterns. And I'll start on the right and the bottom right here. When I'm talking about no change on event, I'm talking about the people that basically put, the same kind of product together year over year. Modest change is an improvement on that. Radical change is a major change. Now, in these red guys, you see an awful lot of this no change and an awful lot of radical change, and sometimes the hybrid where you've gotten both. And in that instance, what we're talking about there is an event that's basically the same event they've always done, but on a completely different season or maybe a different day of the week or something like that. And that proved to be double poison, it seemed like, with two of those types showing up in the red zone here. Compare that to the green here, you see an awful lot of the green guys are doing a moderate change event. That's an event that they change something to make it more interesting year over year. They reinvent themselves a little bit every year. It seemed to be a real good sign of a quality event coming together. You will see a no change event still in the green zone here, where they didn't change a lot year over year, but still had that strong sales to get it done. And then we had one outlier here in the major change, which was the whole point of that event, also doing strong. You look at this at a higher level, though, and you can see that no matter what you did on changing the event, radical or not, the fundamentals carry the day. If you're solid on your planning, organization, selling, and building a good product, the change is less important. But if your fundamentals aren't, then that is going to hit you. And so fundamentals clearly ruled the day on this. And the other thing you're going to also see here, speaking of fundamentals, is it's hard to define which fundamentals are more important than the other one. Obviously, selling tickets we decided was most important of all. But interestingly here, you see a correlation, and we saw this in events not even on this chart, which is anytime you had strong selling, you generally had strong planning and organizing. You almost never see this one, about this one. Even in this softer red zone event here, they sort of correlate. And that's fairly interesting, and I wanted to dive into that a little bit more, so that's exactly what I did. Why is this correlation between planning, organizing, and selling? And the way I did that is I looked at the event life cycle. Events kind of follow a very similar rhythm. There's an event date, and you work back from there. 30, 60, 90 days prior, you're at a certain phase of the planning. And I took two events that were extraordinarily similar, and the blue one and the red one here, and I looked at their communication. Now, these events were similar demographically, similar geographic areas, similar time frame. The committee composition was similar. The DNA of these two events was extraordinarily similar, and they also both used email extensively for their communication. This was useful because I could make a histogram of their communication. So that's exactly what you're looking at here. And what this is email chatter as they plan. Obviously, they didn't have the same exact event date, so I slid one to match the other. So when you're looking at this histogram, you're basically seeing the amount of communication that was occurring relative to their event date. So it's truly apples and apples. And one of the things that should jump out at you here is a couple of these big blue spikes. Now what you're seeing here is an awful lot of chatter going on the blue team and virtually nothing on the red team. That should really be noticeable, and I think this is very significant when we compare what happens here. It's worthy of mentioning that neither of these events had a venue change. So this early chatter was not because they had a problem with the venue or something. That's our true organic communication within the committee as they plan their event. Noteworthy here, there is a big spike off on the right here on the blue side, and that was kind of an odd circumstance where they had a couple merchandise problems actually causing that spike. So it had nothing to do with planning and organizing. It's one of those one-off things, not really useful for analysis, just happened to happen. So, digging deeper. If you look at this blue spike, now, as you get up to your event date, you expect a spike in activity. And sure enough, you see that on both blue and red. But the blue guys, you can see their spike is no higher than it was 90 days before their event. In fact, if you look at the area under the curve here, there's more communication occurring in this 3 to 4 month prior to the event phase than there was in that 10-day prior to event phase. And that's fairly telling about the level of stress and level of planning that's occurred here. You look at the red guys, not so much the case. They're off the chart 10 days before the event. And when you compare that to their kind of planning amount of volume of communication, it's night and day. You're looking at a 6-fold increase almost. So you can almost feel the anxiety as they come up to their event, and there's all kinds of problems that they have to get into reactionary mode for. But it's also telling them the big picture here. And not to be a spoiler here, but you can see almost where this is going to head. And we look at the results financially. The blue event winds up 31%. The red event was down year over year 65%. And again, this is comparing themselves to their previous year's performance. So it's relative to their own performance. So why is that? And here's why I believe that's the case. It's these humps out here to the left. And here's why. When you plan your event, you're organizing and you're planning. Hopefully you're doing both. It's quite possible to plan an event all by just the chair doing it and not really organizing your committee, but usually that doesn't work well. You have to plan and organize, and that creates communication within your team. And that communication, though, has a cycle because that also creates feedback to the planning and organizing. It helps you flush out problems, and it also is improving the buy-in of people by having that participation. And what happens is in this cycle, you repeat the planning and organizing. The communication follows from that planning and organizing. It improves your event through that cycle. And as you're doing that, you get this ancillary effect of motivating. And what happens is these people all of a sudden have motivation to sell tickets by having the buy-in. And here's why. I think the best way to explain that is through an analogy. And if you go back in time about 60 years, people used to make cakes. They made them by scratch. Then Betty Crocker showed up and figured out that you could actually make a cake by adding water and baking it. And they made that product, and they tried to sell it, and it turned out that nobody would buy that product. And they actually had to do a little market research and reinvent their product and pull the oil and eggs back out of the mix and make sure that people added in themselves. The reason was they learned that nobody could actually take ownership of a cake where they merely added water and cooked it. You couldn't show up at somebody's house with that cake and say with a straight face that you had baked it. But somehow, by taking the eggs and the oil or butter out, they crossed the tipping point of ownership. People said, okay, now I feel like I baked this cake. I can take some pride of ownership in it, and I'll buy it, and I'll do that. And that's what happened, and it really hasn't changed much since. Well, you see the same exact effect with your events. This early phase here, where you're doing this communication and this planning and this delegation, is when you're getting the actual committee's buy-in to building a quality event, and they now have a vested interest in putting together a quality product and selling the tickets. So, taking it all together, we always talk about filling the hall as a result of leadership, and we always talked about leadership requiring planning, organization, and communicating. And really, here's the connection though. By planning, organizing, and communicating timely, proactively, as you really early on in the event cycle, these first three things are creating the fourth thing. So, take this all together, here's what you got. Your event success predictors. 100 days before the event, you should be planning and seeing an awful lot of chatter within the committee. And I'm not just talking about the area chair sending emails out to people. I'm talking about chatter within the committee, that back and forth banter that you're looking for that shows and proves that your committee is truly engaged. That is the canary in the coal mine to see if you've got a real team going here. And not to mention, there's the twofold benefit. Besides the buy-in of your committee that you're observing, you're also flushing out problems with your event that are going to save you some stress right before the event. Bullet number 2, of course, recruiting and empowering. That is kind of that analogy with the cake mix. Once people have buy-in, when they have a specific job to do with your event, they're going to have more at stake and do a better job of selling tickets. And the third thing we did see out of here was moderate change. Building a better event year in and year out, it makes it interesting if compared to throwing the same stuff on the same table and hoping the same people come and spend the same money. That's just not going to work. It grows stale and people are going to quit attending your event. So those are the 3 big success predictors that came out of this. On the contrary, some things that were flags for trouble, an abrupt leadership change. And what I believe came out of this is it's not leadership change in and of itself that's the problem, because we expect leadership to change, and some of our change leadership actually had really good improvements. What happens is when you have an abrupt change where the new person doesn't have a feel for the amount of detailed planning that occurs 100 days before your event, is I think when it falls apart. That's why mentorship is so important. That's why finding and identifying your leader long before your event, so he kind of has a year of warm-up to it so they can see all the detail that goes behind the scenes in planning an event and being proactive. Because really what happens here is sometimes that leadership change causes a misstep on this 3 to 4 month out planning phase is what I believe the connection is there. Of course, the other bullet here, radical event change. Changing dramatically your day of the week or your season invariably is exposure to a problem. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying be prepared for some downside if you're going to consider it. And of course, the last thing was a no change event. I already talked about that. Don't let your event get stale or you're sooner or later going to pay the price. So with that, that's all the time I have. I certainly appreciate your time, and I wish you the very best of luck with your Ducks Unlimited event. Thanks.